The cruiser lights exploded out of nowhere on the empty road, tearing the night apart in red and blue. It wasn't a warning. It was an order. Alexis Ward eased her pickup to the shoulder, her heart beating to the dry rhythm of the flashing lights behind her. When she turned off the engine, the silence grew heavy, the kind that announces trouble. She kept her hands on the wheel. She always did. The moon pierced through the windshield, casting light on her pale face, her silver-white hair glowing like a mistake that this town had never learned to accept. Albino. Different. Too strange for this county. The first step the cop took was a kick to the truck's door. License. Now. The flashlight hit her eyes. Too bright. Too cruel. Alexis blinked, feeling the sting rise. Not out of weakness, but because she knew exactly where this kind of stop could lead. The second cop chuckled low. Alone, at night, in this truck? He tilted his head, assessing. You chose the wrong place to drive. Alexis took a deep breath, not to calm herself, but because from that moment on, everything they did here would have consequences they couldn't imagine. They thought they had stopped just any woman, and that was their first mistake. She rolled down the window before the deputy reached her door. Evening, she said. Her voice carried the calm of someone who'd spent decades commanding people in chaos. Calm was a discipline, not a mood. Deputy Dawson's flashlight cut across the dash. He didn't meet her eyes. He zeroed on the license and registration. His partner, Riker, lingered near the trunk with his hand casually on his duty belt. Both badges gleamed in the light like blunt instruments. License and proof of insurance, Dawson intoned. Words were exchanged, the usual small talk of an uneventful stop, a headlight out, a missing inspection sticker. Dawson's tone shifted somewhere between perfunctory and preemptive. He asked if she'd been drinking. Alexis replied no, concisely. He asked where she was coming from. She said the interstate, returning home for the weekend. Then one of them barked a question at her that didn't fit the stop. You got warrants? She laughed once, light and startled. No. The laugh turned into something else when Dawson reached into the cab without asking and grabbed Alexis's phone off the passenger seat. He said he had reason to suspect, never specified. That reach was a breach of 100 small courtesies. It was also the spark the night needed to flare into flames. Alexis's hand went for the phone. Sir, you don't. Hands where I can see them. When Riker's hand tightened on Alexis's arm, something in the set of his jaw told her this wasn't about a headlight. I smelled the roadside, gasoline, old smoke, and behind it the electricity of men practiced in policing as power. I had stared down that look before, not from a cruiser, but from an enemy trench. I knew escalation when I saw it.
The first shove sent her against the hood, her white hair feathered across the metal like paper. Someone in a passing pickup leaned out and clicked record on their phone, the blue beam from their taillights skittering across the deputies' faces. A child on the sidewalk, Mrs. Taylor's grandson, she later learned, peeked from behind his mother's legs, wide-eyed and holding a lollipop. Get out, a voice said. Not an order, but a demand with the kind of casual violence learned in too many badge locker rooms. Alexis stepped out on reflex, hands visible. She did not run. That's when the force turned personal. Reynolds, who was not on patrol but showed up seconds later like backup summoned by instinct rather than radio, lunged and brought the butt of his flashlight across Alexis's ribs. The blow wasn't aimed to kill, it was meant to humiliate and to make compliance less a choice than an inevitability. Alexis's training engaged. She made room, pivoted, closed the gap in a motion seamless as wind folding into a storm. You wouldn't call what she did graceful. It was precise and brutal in the way necessary to stop someone from being killed. She used leverage against the next shove, and without delivering clear damage, neutralized the immediate threat. Rope and push and a throw that left Dawson on his knees clutching a bruised shoulder. That was the moment the crowd's phone lights became a field of stars. She could have escalated, they all could have, but she didn't reach for a weapon. When a deputy went for a taser, Alexis slapped the device aside with the back of her hand and twisted under the arm reach, pinning it to the asphalt until it clicked harmlessly. The scuffle lasted less than a minute, but it rearranged how the night would be remembered. They cuffed her afterward. They read her rights in the fluorescent glare of a patrol car while someone in the crowd shouted that they had it all on video. Deputy Matthews took her phone and tucked it into his jacket, saying he was securing it as evidence. He did not record the seizure on his body cam. His body cam, Alexis's attorney would later learn, had gone offline at 23:12, 40 seconds before the initial contact. In the watchful journalism of phone cameras and a dozen witness accounts, the physicality of the stop was clear. Force used that went well beyond reasonable. What would complicate the story, what would make it a tissue of plausible deniability and deliberate erasure, was the speed with which official logs were amended and with which a narrative was prepared to swallow the footage whole. At the station, the processing officer, Slate, on the desk, moved with the practiced economy of someone who'd been there a long time. The custodial report listed her offenses succinctly: resisting arrest, assault on an officer, obstruction. The forms were clean, the language clinical and damning. A smear article that would print 2 days later used the same phrasing almost verbatim.
Someone in communications had a draft ready, and it looked like they'd called it in as soon as the cuffs clicked. Harper Lane found her in a holding cell the next morning. Harper didn't look like a crusading TV lawyer. She was shorter than Alexis, her hair cropped close, her suit a deliberate matte. But the way she scanned the evidence package handed to her, cell phone video from a neighbor, a shaky dashcam clip from a passing truck, a transcript of dispatch calls, gave away the mental steadiness of someone who'd spent many sleepless months untangling official obfuscation. "You filmed?" Harper asked. "Yes," Alexis said. Her voice was steady, but the edges of her vision blurred with the sting of bruises she'd felt in muscle and memory. Even now, under the fluorescent hum, she could feel the press of being read by 1,000 eyes. "Where's the rest?" "Matthews took my phone." Harper's face didn't change. "We can get copies. Federal evidence vaults, chain of custody demands. But first, we ask for the body cam footage. Every officer on scene's body cam, every cruiser dash cam, subpoena the lot." Harper's plan was basic law and powerful nonetheless. Document everything, force the department into producing records, and create redundancy. Recordings, witnesses, timestamps. If you pile enough independent proofs together, erasure becomes expensive and visible. "There's one other thing," Harper said. "We need to get your footage off-site, now." Alexis nodded. She'd learned long ago the safest copies were not the ones you trusted to a device in uniformed hands. When they took her phone, she'd managed to send a fragment of the initial contact to a burner number she'd kept for emergencies, a thread of foresight born of years where assumptions about safety were illusions. Harper had told her to do more the moment she was cuffed: notification to a federal contact, a backup upload, delivery of encrypted keys. "You think they're going to blow the cameras?" Alexis asked. "I think they already have, but they make mistakes, people leak, and someone always records when they're trying to not be recorded." The prosecutor's office in the county had a history, Harper said, of looking inward with the same sort of affection a mother gives to a troublesome child. Local pride can be dangerous. It breeds solidarity where oversight is needed. Then Harper said a name Alexis would later repeat like a talisman: Daniel Cross, Department of Justice Civil Rights Investigator. Harper had a number. She placed the call herself. When Cross's voice came down the line, it was slow and measured enough that Alexis thought she was hearing him think. "We need to see the video, Miss Ward, and I need to know if anyone has been harmed." "I did nothing but defend myself," Alexis said. Saying it out loud had its own kind of steel. "They grabbed my phone and disabled my camera." "Document everything," Cross said. "Write down every name you can remember.
If there's a pattern here, if other stops show the same glitches, tell us." They processed paperwork faster than the district press release could be written. That same afternoon, an op-ed hit a local news site: "Armed woman attacks officers during traffic stop," a headline barbed with suggestion and repetition. The article quoted an anonymous source, department insiders, and used phrases that sounded like they came straight from a police press packet: disturbing resistance, unprovoked attack, deputies sustained minor injuries. The article included a grainy photo of a scuffle, but no byline. A later check would reveal the reporter was new, and the editor had a long-standing relationship with the sheriff's office. The smear campaign was efficient and surgical. Within 18 hours, a private investigator called Harper to say that someone had begun running background checks on Alexis, dredging up old enlistment records and a divorce that shouldn't have mattered. Her name was threaded in a public comment thread that painted her as unpredictable and unstable. The county paper ran a letter to the editor suggesting veterans sometimes have trouble adjusting, a euphemism that doubles as finger-wagging judgment. The weaponization of inference is as corrosive as the weaponization of force. It turns facts into fog. Harper filed a motion for immediate preservation of evidence. She demanded body cam footage, dash cam logs, radio transmissions, and any evidence of officer GPS tracking. A judge, one of the few who still insisted on documents rather than spectacle, signed the order. But within the department, someone had already hit delete. Matthews's body cam had been returned to active duty without the upload tag. Riker's unit had maintenance logs with the timestamp removed. The in-house IT admin shrugged when subpoenaed. We had a system failure. Alexis sat in a gray chair that afternoon and thought of her mother, Sarah. Sarah had been a school secretary her whole life,
a woman who set out snacks for neighborhood kids and knew every child's name. She had a laugh like a small bell and a tendency to keep a pot simmering on the back of the stove. She also had a way of doing the simplest thing, standing up for a complaint, calling out an injustice at a board meeting, that made her the kind of person the local powers tolerated until she crossed them. A day after the stop, Sarah called from her small house with its sagging porch to say there were men in suits at the door asking about Alexis. Sarah's voice trembled, not with fear, but with the brittle anger of someone whose privacy had been violated, and whose daughter's name had become public fodder. "They wanted to see my papers," she said there was a warrant for unpaid fines, said I shouldn't interfere with an ongoing investigation. Later that night, an officer knocked her down the steps with a shove when she asked to see a badge. She wasn't violent, she protested loudly, bewildered.
The officers cuffed her on a trespassing charge on a flimsy clerical warrant someone had conjured up in the middle of the night. Her arrest photo, eyes red from crying, hair in a bun gone loose, ran in the same smear feed with captions that implied defensiveness rather than victimhood. That kind of pressure was no accident. Retaliation against family has a long and ugly shelf life in corrupt networks. It signals the willingness to punish beyond the target as a way to break resolve. Harper said it aloud in the conference room, the words sharp. They're playing chess. They're trying to sacrifice a pawn to unsettle the queen. Alexis didn't play chess. She'd been trained to read the board as an extension of human behavior. She knew that when an opponent makes a public, reckless play, it is sometimes desperation, not confidence. She filed emergency writs to free her mother, to quash the fabricated warrant. The judge assigned to the case, Judge Marshall, a woman known for exacting demeanor and a tolerance for inconvenient truth, reviewed the file and ordered Sarah released on her own recognizance pending further inquiry. The charges remained on paper, a threat dangling like a clumsy noose. "Don't go to the house alone," Harper warned. "They've already shown they're willing to escalate." "I won't," Alexis said. But even as she promised, her mind circled the officers who had looked at her in the light and decided she was someone to be punished for reasons that had little to do with law and everything to do with power. Back at her lawyer's office, Alexis began laying a careful trail. She dictated every name she could remember: Dawson, Riker, Matthews, Reynolds, Slate, Lieutenant Briggs, whom someone had whispered about in the jailhouse, an organizer of unofficial tactics meetings, and an ambitious man who collected favors like trophies. She documented times and places. Harper's assistant made copies and stored them on encrypted drives in 2 different states. Harper told Alexis to make multiple physical copies and mail them to different attorneys, to create redundancy like a digital lifeline. "Make backups," Harper said. "Wire them to me and to Cross. If they try to erase, we'll still have something." Alexis photographed the bruise on her arm with her left hand and sent it to 3 contacts along with the short recording she'd managed to upload the night of the stop. The street cam footage from the passing pickup and a neighbor's doorbell camera showed the initial shove and part of the melee. The shaky framing and poor light did them no favors, but the angles corroborated one another. Each frame was redundant proof. As the legal machinery spun, the sheriff's office moved to contain the narrative. Internal memos leaked, purportedly from an officers' union, about the difficulty of policing veterans.
Press releases emphasized that deputies had responded to reports of a disturbance and had acted appropriately, while a deputy on the beat got his social media handle scrubbed and reset as if to remove any trace of the original interaction. When an anonymous source called a local talk radio host and said Alexis had a history of instability, it was all the SMEM needed to take wing. The host didn't ask for proof. Inflammatory content drives ratings and suits a narrative some audiences had already accepted. Story after story filtered out of town and into the state feed, each one finding a new way to present the same thin accusation. She attacked officers. She's a danger. She needs to be contained. Alexis watched the feed with the quiet horror of someone seeing their life rearranged in real time. Her phone buzzed constantly. Messages of support from ex-military buddies, calls from old friends who offered to testify, a tense voicemail from Daniel Cross asking if she had a safe place to stay. Cross's team wanted to ensure her safety and to begin a quiet parallel investigation. He said he had a few names that had surfaced in prior complaints, patterns that suggested financial incentives bundled into law enforcement decisions, transport contracts, private correctional facilities that benefited from higher arrest rates. "There's a paper trail," Cross said. "We need to find the receipts." "Private contractors?" Alexis asked. "Possibly. We'll follow the money. But we need to move carefully. Public leaks will jeopardize the probes." Harper was already on it. She filed a public records request for the department's maintenance logs and for the GPS data from the patrol cars that night. She subpoenaed the county's contract records with private detention facilities. If there were kickbacks, she said, they'd show up in payments with vague descriptors, consulting fees, liaison services, but they'd show. Alexis kept doing what had kept her alive in other places. She documented. After the phone was returned with a lab-stamped note of evidence, Harper got the custody log that showed the moment the device had been examined, and, crucially, didn't show an upload to the department server. They discovered a third-party transfer, a copy pulled by an officer the night of the stop and later deleted from the server. "You can't delete what multiple people have," Harper said, "but you can try." They held a press conference to tell a different version of the story. Harper stood at the podium and spoke plainly about the need for body cam footage and transparency. She named the law that required preservation of evidence and quoted specific timestamps. The sheriff's office sent a low-level spokesperson who spoke in cliches and refused to provide footage. The public's trust hung like a fraying rope between the two speeches.
The community reacted the way communities always react when authority looks like it is closing ranks. Some defended the deputies, some demanded answers. A group of veterans organized a small solidarity march. Local advocates for police reform came out of the woodwork to offer statements of support. On the county's social media pages, comments became battlegrounds. Meanwhile, something else moved in the background, an internal message board used by deputies and civilians that Harper's team subpoenaed. Files on that board included references to a vendor, Northbridge Logistics, and invoices that matched payments to a private detention holding facility that took in overflow arrests. Those invoices correlated with a pattern of sudden, unexplained increases in detentions during months when the sheriff's office had leadership retreats and when new vendors were brought on shore. The names on the invoices were thin and corporate, but Cross's team had people who knew how to read corporate opacity. They traced payments through shell companies to executives who had quietly contributed to sheriff campaign funds. The revelations didn't immediately free Sarah Ward. Retaliation often runs deeper than the immediate hand that cuffs. The county's administrative apparatus moved with a slowness designed to exhaust. A hearing to quash the warrant was scheduled weeks out. In that stretch, someone left a threatening note on Sarah's windshield, an anonymous sentiment that meant very little when taken alone, and everything when paired with a pattern of targeted harassment. UDOT citations taped to the mailbox, a towing notice left in the dead of night, a glowing report from a neighbor about the family's suspicious activities. Alexis found herself sitting in the dim of her mother's kitchen, watching Sarah fold a dish towel. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon and lemon. Sarah had a faint bruise along her jaw where an officer had grabbed her, evidence of unprofessional roughness that the sheriff's office called standard procedure when confronted. The bruise would fade, but the humiliation would stick, the way a fingernail can graze skin and leave an imprint felt for days after the surface has healed. "You should go somewhere safe," Sarah said. "I can't," Alexis replied. "If I leave it alone, they win by default." Sarah smiled that small, steady smile that had kept Alexis going through deployments and through nights when the weight of command pressed down on her shoulders. "You always said you fought so other people didn't have to." "What if this time they keep coming?" Alexis asked, not as a question but as an assessment of risk. "Then you keep fighting," Sarah said, "but not to hurt more people, to make sure what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else." That became the fulcrum of Alexis's decision. Up until then, she had been reactive. She had documented and secured evidence. She had followed Harper's counsel.
But when a pattern of deletions and leaks suggested a deliberate cover-up with resources and allies, that reactive posture would not suffice. The department had weaponized bureaucracy. It had a network that included sympathetic media, friendly vendors, and elected officials who valued reputation over truth. To break it, she would have to force a moment of exposure that could not be simply erased. A recorded confession, a deliberate act by the corrupt actors in plain sight that would leave no room for a system failure excuse. She didn't immediately tell Harper about the plan she began to fold in her head. It was small at first, a thought that needed testing, an idea to pull them into revealing their true playbook. She contacted a former informant, someone who used to transport detainees for Northbridge Logistics and who owed Harper a favor from a case years ago. The informant, a woman named Layla, had been released from a low-level sentence after Harper argued for leniency. She had a thin yet reliable network. Layla's tip was blunt. They like to move people in the night. They don't like cameras, but they love an impound lot after hours. They think no one watches. "Why would they go there?" Alexis asked. "It's where they transfer custody out of county. It's where receipts get swapped. It's quieter, less risk of witnesses." "All right," Alexis said. Her mind sharpened into the subroutines it had kept for so long. Study behavior, identify patterns, exploit habit. "Can you get me a list of who runs the shifts? Names, times, any slack in security?" Layla hesitated, for fear and for the weight of putting someone on the line. "I can get you a footprint, but you need something else. You need a way to make them reveal themselves." Alexis pictured the impound lot in the rash moonlight, the chain-link fence, the security lights humming like a heartbeat. It was a place where the invisible could become visible if one could bait the right players. But this was a dangerous escalatory move. one that might involve confrontation again, and a chance the plan could go sideways. Alex's mouth tasted of metal at the thought. She didn't take violence lightly. She had a hard line in her head. Whatever she did had to leave room for the law to work, not preclude it. She called Cross and Harper in the same breath, telling them that she was considering a way to force exposure. Harper's jaw tightened over the phone. "You are not to do anything that could be construed as entrapment," she said. "We need results in court, not a sensational viral clip." "Not entrapment," Alexis said. "A controlled provocation. I want it on record. I want witnesses. I want agents present if we can possibly arrange it. But I'm not going to sit and wait for them to pick up my mother again." Harper's pause was long enough to register the weight of the choice she faced. Lawyers' ethics against the urgency on the ground. "We can coordinate with Cross," she said finally. "But we have to be careful."
Federal agents can't just drop in without probable cause, and we can't risk agency jurisdiction problems. Cross's voice came over the line again, measured, early morning tired. "If you set a trap, it needs to be so clean that the department has no plausible deniability. If you can get an overt act, documented, recorded with witnesses, then we can act. But if it looks like you're provoking, we're on shaky ground." Alexis weighed those options in the silence that followed. She thought of Mrs. Taylor's grandson, of Sarah's bruise, of lines of invoices that hid in plain sight. If she wanted to pull the thread and unravel what had been stitched to the sheriff's office, she had to look for the stitch that connected the men in uniform to the men in suits. "Then let's make it so they can't lie about it," she said. That night she sat in her mother's dark living room and made a list. Names, times, probable moves. She took the small camera Harper had insisted she carry and practiced angles, not to teach how to fight, only to know how a scene would read on film. She cataloged possible witnesses: the pickup truck driver who'd filmed the stop, Mrs. Taylor, Layla, the informant, the tow truck driver who often worked off hours. She put physical copies of the files in a lockbox and mailed duplicates to a friend in a different state. Decentralization was insurance against the department's habit of wiping hard drives. Outside, a crow called and dropped its sound into the night. In Alexis's mind, a plan began to feel less like a rash orchestration and more like a necessary sequence. Bait, witness, record, federal presence, arrest. It was coldly pragmatic and fiercely moral at once. She did not want to enjoy the sort of confrontation that required force. She wanted leverage that could not be erased by code. She wanted a single moment when an officer's choice would be witnessed and therefore accountable. But before any bait could be set, there was another wound to stitch. Their first attempts at erasing the initial stop had worked in small ways. The dash cam missing timestamp, the body cam that conveniently malfunctioned. Those holes needed filling with proof recovered from other sources. The pickup driver's phone had uploaded his clip to a social server where backups existed. Harper had already extracted a dozen copies and asked Alexis to note unique elements: phrases officers used, gestures that were out of policy, the precise timing of a taser deployment. Each small detail was a chisel on the wall the department had built. "You're not the only one who keeps records," Harper said, "and you're not the only one they'll pick on. We need to make it costlier for them to hide." Alexis thought of the men who'd reached for their badges and believed themselves above reproach. She thought of the 1,000 small acts of collusion that keep institution afloat: the deleted file, the anonymous tip, the editorial that doesn't ask questions.
If their culture could be bought and polished, then it could be exposed and reformed. But the danger was immediate. 2 days after Sarah's release, a tow truck showed up at dawn and took Alexis's mother's car. The county had issued a civil lien for unpaid fines of an account that matched Sarah's name, but listed an address she'd never used. The truck driver refused to accept questions about paperwork. When Alexis called to protest, she was told the release order had come through standard channels. The paperwork, Harper later demonstrated, was forged. They had started hitting back with paper and testimony, but paper moves slowly. Months can pass while a legal machine grinds. In the meantime, the people who decided to dirty their hands had to be stopped from inflicting further harm. A rumor skittered across the department's gossip channels and the courthouse steps, the sort of rumor that corrodes trust. Lieutenant Briggs was angling for promotion. He was known to clean up the department's numbers. He liked his statistics tidy, and if that required a hand on the scale, well, someone else had a hand on the scale already. Harper and Cross both had reason to believe Briggs' hands might be tied to contracts that route detainees out of county. "Briggs isn't stupid," Cross said on a phone call. "He knows the cameras are the problem. He thinks he's covered. We need an overt act." An overt act. The phrase bounced in Alexis's head. It was what the law needed, something definitive, observable, indisputable. It was also what the corrupt feared most, because there is no cleaner weapon against a conspiracy than sunlight. She began to feel the planning like a scar forming, a new tension in her muscles, a light touch where the old bruise met resilience.
She called Layla again and asked for something more definite. Who moved the transfers? Who scheduled the impounds? Layla could get a list. She could get names that hinted at the network. She couldn't, she said, get the men themselves to act unless they could be provoked into a public transgression. How do you make men used to secrecy act in the open? Alexis asked. Give them a reason to believe they're protecting something, Layla said. They'll always do that. Alexis's plan then would have to present a threat they couldn't ignore, something that would involve moving an asset, changing a ledger, taking custody in a way that left fingerprints in plain sight, something that would put the corrupt officers on camera, something that would expose the chain from patrol to impound to vendor. It was dangerous, but so was doing nothing. She began to draft the bait. It would be small at first, signal a vulnerable transfer that would be tempting enough for them to seize control of it. She would make it visible. She would ghost a call into a vendor's office pretending to arrange a late-night transfer of an asset. She would do it in a way that would be traceable. She would round up witnesses.
She would ask Cross if his team could be staged to arrive once the bite was taken. Harper read the outline Alexis put on the table and did not smile. This is risky, she said, but under it was a recognition. This was how you break a protected pattern. The trick would be making the move undeniable in court and impossible to spin away as provocation. Whatever happens, Harper said, we'll need backups. We will need you to document everything as if we're already in discovery. If anything goes wrong, the last thing we need is a defense that says we set them up. Alexis agreed. She would not set the crime, she would present an opportunity. The difference, subtle as it might be to the casual observer, mattered in the light of law. They drew up a conservative timeline. First, accumulate corroborating footage from independent sources. Second, identify the transfer, an impound pickup where they could expect the men to move an item off the books. Third, make the transfer visible. Fourth, alert Cross to be prepared to move. At midnight, Alexis sat at her mother's kitchen table and looked at the impound lot's location on the county GIS map on her laptop. She had no illusions about what would come next. She had been trained to anticipate all the ways things could go wrong. She also knew that the only thing that allowed her to sleep at night was the idea that she was fighting not just for herself, but for a standard of accountability that could save someone else from the same bruised humiliation. Behind the house, a sprinkler hissed and the porch light glowed, a pool of warm yellow that had welcomed visitors for decades. Sarah went to bed with the radio murmuring softly. Local news moved through the fog of print and opinion. On the kitchen counter, Alexis lined up the cameras and hard drives Harper had bought, the encryption keys folded into her wallet. She thought about the deputies who thought they could break her, who had placed their hands on her as if ownership had ever been theirs to claim. If they find out who our mother is, she said aloud to the empty room, not as a boast, but as a reckoning, what do they expect will happen? Sarah's life had never granted her power on the scale of the sheriff's office, but Sarah's presence, her quiet refusal to be moved, had already forced the county to show its hand. The men in uniform had overreached by making a family member a target. Miscalculation often punished hardest when it becomes public. Alexis centered herself on that miscalculation. If one of the network's moves could be exposed on tape, if one man would confess under the heat of undeniable proof, then she could unpick the rest. She began to feel the plan like muscle memory forming, careful, deliberate, and steeped in an ethic she'd never abandon. She would bait them, but she would not entrap them. She would let them be the ones to commit the overt act. A week of quiet, watchful preparation followed.
At 03:12 one Sunday morning, the county impound security system showed movement. A transfer was scheduled. The account number on the order matched a shell company's invoice. The tow operator listed a deputy's name as point of contact. Layla texted a picture of a ledger page, names, dates, a small scrawled note that suggested looser accounting the night before. Alexis's heart thudded as she forwarded the image to Harper and Cross. The game was being set on a board they had been watching for months. If the men she suspected were involved, they'd be tempted to step in, to correct a ledger, to hide a transfer. They'd choose the impound because they thought they were safe there. Now it was time to see if the men who believed themselves untouchable would make the same mistake again. The next move would either reveal their network in Technicolor or push her and her allies back into a longer fight. Either way, she was no longer willing to wait for the system to decide. She slept for 2 hours that night, the way a person sleeps before something finally happens, fitful, with the mind alert to phantom alarms. Dawn took the edge off the night and left her with the weight of what's to come. She packed her bag, checked the camera batteries twice, and drove out to a vantage point across from the impound lot. The county courthouse clock read 06 o'clock. Somewhere between the quiet of the early morning and the first chirp of a patrol radio, the choice was no longer theoretical. It had teeth. It would force the corrupt to make a move, and in that forced move, she would make sure there was light enough to see every inch of their intent. The impound lot sat under a sodium orange sky. chain-link fences casting diamond shadows across rows of battered cars. Security lights hummed like reluctant sentries. Alexis watched from a parked sedan 2 blocks away, lenses hooded against the glare, breath measured the way it had been for decades when everything depended on patience. Harbor was on one radio, Cross on a secured line, and Layla's messages blinked with last-minute confirmations. Tow operator, shift names, a deputy listed as the contact. The bait had been small and deliberate. A late-night transfer order for a vehicle whose paperwork traced to a shell company connected to Northbridge Logistics. It smelled like a bookkeeping problem. For most eyes, it was a tedious administrative job. For the men who trade custody and invoices for kickbacks, it was a chance to reroute a problem quietly out of county. They liked quiet. They thought quiet meant safe. A beat-up cruiser rolled in first, a familiar silhouette. Matthews climbed out, his jaw set the way it often did when someone thought they were doing God's work. Next came Riker, then Dawson, the predictable pattern of bodies Alexis had cataloged in her head like coordinates. They moved with the economy of people who perform certain actions so often they called them routine.
It was one of the things that made them dangerous. Ritual becomes moral cover. Alexis kept her camera alive, but not obvious. She had cameras where they couldn't easily sweep them. A small thermal lens tucked in a shrub, a dash cam running from a decoy vehicle, Harper's attorney tech recording from the periphery. Layla had managed to get the tow operator on the phone at an arranged time, and as planned, the operator called the deputy listed as contact to say the transfer needed to be moved immediately. The voice on the recorded call used shorthand that meant what it had always meant in that county. Move the vehicle, move the problem. They circled the car like predators. Words were exchanged in clipped sentences. Hands found radios, then pockets, then the pragmatic roughness of a world that moved by force. One of them, someone whose name Alexis had heard in half-dark rumor, Lieutenant Briggs, walked out of the shadows with the kind of walking that looked like authority wearing a costume. He leaned over the car, then turned back toward the chain link and said something that carried across to the cameras. "Let's just do it," Briggs said, voice low, the kind of direction given when men expect no consequences, no witnesses, no fuss. That was the moment Alexis had prepared for. Not the shove, not the flash of anger, but the attempt to privatize an act that belonged in public record. She stepped out of her concealment in plain view, no aggression in her posture, and walked toward the group holding a small camera as proof, not a threat. "You're not moving anything," she said clearly, the camera catching the line of her jaw. It was a simple statement. It had the weight of law on one side and the weight of ethics on the other. The deputy nearest her smirked. "Step back, ma'am. This is county business." "I am here to observe," Alexis said. "This transfer is on a disputed account. You know me. You know the case. We have counsel here." That little name drop was a soft theater of deterrence meant to slow the air. For a second, things teetered between legality and bravado. Then Briggs' hand curled around a radio mic and he barked a command that fluttered like a bird against a storm. "Move her," a voice said. "Keep it clean." They tried to reach for her. 2 hands reached at once, a snack of muscle and technique. Alexis didn't fight by lunging. She used spacing and leverage, parrying, not to teach anyone a move, but to remove hands from intent. A scuffle started, faster than the eye sometimes registers. A shoulder caught, a cuff misswinging, a deputy's anger untempered. And then, like someone flipping a switch, headlights swept across the lot and multiple federal vehicles rolled in. Cross's agents had staged a perimeter that closed like fingers around the lot. Their presence was quiet but absolute. The men in county uniforms who had expected impunity found it had evaporated into the morning air. "FBI, everyone stay where you are."
An agent called, voice amplified by authority and evidence. Metallic clicks of recorders stitched themselves into the scene. Cameras that had been hidden now arrived in plain sight, and the deputies who had maneuvered themselves into a private act were suddenly acting on a public stage. Briggs froze in a way the camera caught, the slight hitch of a man who knows the rules but thought the rules were applied elsewhere. Cross's team moved methodically, not theatrically, because the legal work depended on clean custody and clear evidence. Agents read rights to the deputies in the manner they read rights to citizens. The microphone on the hood of a federal car picked up everything. "You're under federal investigation for obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence," one of the agents told them. "Anything you say may be used against you." Briggs turned. For the first time his voice showed a crack, a syllable that had not been prepped in his public relations training. "You have no jurisdiction." Cross stepped forward, small and professional, and simply said, "We do when civil rights and interstate money trails are involved." A camera then captured something Wallace County's internal memo had tried to keep private. A deputy who had been one of the call participants, someone earlier complicit in deleting files, began to talk. He didn't start with grand confessions. He started small, the way people always do, with a name here, a ledger entry there, a memory of a transfer at O2. But once forward motion began, it built. The man was tired, and tired people sometimes tell the truth. Northbridge pays for liaison services, he said. We routed overflow to them, and invoices came back labeled as transport fees, and what did you receive? An agent asked. A pause, a throat clearing. Cash, checks, some donations to the sheriff's campaign. Sometimes we covered fines so families couldn't. The sentence faltered. The man looked like someone who had been corralling moral discomfort for years and found he could not hold it anymore. On a separate recorder, Briggs's voice rose a degree higher. We kept it internal. It was practical. No need to drag things in public. Cross had agent teams seize phones and servers, image drives mirroring hard disks before anyone could touch them, careful to maintain the chain of custody that would make the evidence bulletproof in court. Harper had a field attorney document the sequence of events, taking notes she would later swear to under oath. The impound lot's own security footage, putatively turned off during earlier transfers, had a backup file mirroring the stream up in cloud backups. It too was captured. Under the pressure of federal presence and the inevitability of recorded truth, words found the cracks. Names of the corporate executives, routes through shell companies, times and notations of payment.
One officer, voice shaking, admitted he had personally taken a copy of Alexis's phone at the station and moved copies to a private drive. Another recited a list of deputies who had been told to stand down on certain transfers. When the men realized their private ledger was being read by a different sort of auditor, their demeanor shifted from bravado to calculation. Briggs tried one last time to command the narrative. We were protecting the department, he said. We were managing public safety. By enriching middlemen, an agent shot back? By fabricating fines? By making arrests for profit? The question hung in the lot like an accusation with teeth. For the first time, the men understood the frame of what they'd done, not merely sloppy or shady, criminal. The recordings that federal teams took that morning would later be transcribed, time-stamped, and correlated with bank movements. Each piece became a diorama of complicity. There was one moment that would later replay on local channels in a way that stopped the county's usual practices cold. A deputy, young and newly on the job, confessed on camera that a superior had instructed him to remove the upload tag from his body cam to fix the feed. He named names. He wept quietly as he said it. In that weeping was the demolition of a cover story. The system failures had human actors. The sweep was surgical. Men were handcuffed, hard drives were wheeled out in Pelican cases, corporate records were photocopied on the spot. The impound lot that had smelled of gasoline and old upholstery now carried the bright tang of change. The fallout came quickly. Within 48 hours, an indictment unspooled like a rope being thrown into stormwater. A federal grand jury returned counts for obstruction, conspiracy to deprive rights under color of law, and multiple counts linked to financial fraud. Subpoenas went out to Northbridge Logistics, whose executives tried to keep their faces polite in the face of a subpoena that asked for every invoice for the past 5 years. Leases, shell company records, and donor lists were traced until the money's path no longer resembled a shadow, but a map. In court, the prosecution presented what mattered most to the long arc of accountability: authenticated media. The pickup driver's footage, previously slated for deletion by an officer's removed upload, was verified by forensic experts. The metadata matched timestamps recorded on the impound zone logs. Phone extraction showed that Matthews had indeed accessed an alternate route to copy Alexis's phone content onto a personal drive. Email chains between a county administrator and a private contractor used phrases that indicted intent: overflow, liaison services, priority clients, and these phrases carried a meaning that became hard to blur in testimony. Judge Marshall, who'd been watching the pretrial fight like a hawk, presided with the precise temperament of someone who respected evidence over rhetoric. At a hearing where the defense for the county argued for local handling, she unrolled the chain of custody on the floor, like a seamstress showing that a garment had been tailored to hide defects. "I am persuaded," she said finally, the words slow and deliberate. "The evidence indicates coordinated action to obfuscate official records and to interfere with a citizen's ability to seek redress. The preservation orders were thwarted. This court cannot bless a pattern that appears systemic." The county's attorney tried to speak. The judge's hand was already a closure. "This matter merits federal review," she added. "I will dismiss, without prejudice, any local charges against Ms. Ward pending the outcome of the federal inquiry." Those words did two things at once. They relieved Alexis momentarily, and they widened the investigation's lens. The deputies who had bet on a closed system felt the edges fall away.
Sarah Ward was exonerated in the simplest practical sense. The trumped-up warrant was quashed, and the trespassing charges were dropped. Proof that the warrant had been fabricated took the form of a photocopied clerk stamp that did not match the county's official log, an obvious forgery once a handwriting analyst compared the signature to existing records. The judge ordered a thorough inquiry into the issuance of the warrant and assigned a special master to ensure no loose paperwork can be used as a cudgel again. Against that legal wind, Cross and Harper orchestrated one more strategic move, a public reveal they knew would undo any last seams of protective solidarity. They planned a press briefing coordinated with the DOJ's Civil Rights Division. The aim was not theater for its own sake, but a clear, careful unveiling of facts, the chain of recordings, the financial records linking deputies to private vendors, and statements from cooperating witnesses. When the press conference started, Cross read the evidence with the austerity of someone who knew how much damage the truth could do when laid properly on a table. He did not ask for justice in rhetorical flourishes. He presented it in forensic terms. He described bank transfers, timelines, and the federal statutes alleged to have been violated. On a screen behind him, the footage from the impound lot played, uncut, time-stamped, and accompanied by the federal team's notes. And then Harper, with Alexis at her side, stepped forward to announce a procedural shift with a one-line flourish that the county would not have anticipated. Sarah Ward had agreed to become the named plaintiff in a federal civil rights suit against the county. She would stand publicly as the face of the case. With the DOJ's backing, her case would have the weight of federal resources and the subpoena power that comes with it. It was not just that Sarah was a plaintiff.
Cross had quietly ensured that Sarah had also accepted an appointment as a community liaison to the newly formed Special Oversight Commission the DOJ was establishing for the district, an advisory but potent position created to ensure local input in the federal inquiry. The title might have seemed ceremonial to casual observers, but in this county, it was a different animal. The liaison would be the official channel through which the DOJ would solicit community testimony and would coordinate protective measures for witnesses. The appointment was public, timely, and symbolically devastating. When the local footage of the press conference made the evening news, the reaction in the sheriff's office was instantaneous. Men who had counted on local insulation watched the screen in small rooms where conversations dried up. The idea that their actions would now be parsed by federal counsel, that a woman from the town's most ordinary house would be the named plaintiff in a suit with subpoena power, made them step back as if from a flame. "They know our names now," one deputy whispered into a phone, and the whisper traveled like a rumor into the narrow worlds where men kept their reputations. "They know everything." Panic is a particular feeling when it collides with administration. Memos were pulled, schedules shimmered as officers' badges were momentarily docked for reassignment. Internal emails that had been proud and private were suddenly evidence. The sheriff's PR machine switched from defense to damage control. Press conferences were called where the sheriff promised full cooperation. Later, as inquiries intensified, the promises began to look like a thin curtain shielding a construction. For Alexis, the moment of media attention was not sweet. Cameras can be both vindication and salt. She had not sought fame. She had sought a fact, that the system processed truthfully. But she recognized as she watched her mother's calm face on the screen that this particular kind of visibility was life-saving. People who had previously resigned themselves to quiet and justice now had a model for resistance. They had a woman from their town, Sarah Ward, standing in the light with the DOJ at her back. That specificity of face mattered in a county where anonymity had been exploited. The criminal case rolled forward in measured, technically precise steps. Indictments named specific defendants, Lieutenant Briggs, Matthews, Riker, and a mid-level county administrator. Counts included conspiracy to deprive rights, tampering with witnesses, and wire fraud connected to the transfer of funds to shell companies. Northbridge Logistics executives faced counts for conspiracy to commit fraud and for bribery. As papers moved through the federal courthouse, assets were frozen pending forfeiture proceedings. In a separate lane, Alexis and Harper filed a civil suit seeking damages for excessive force and malicious prosecution.
They demanded reforms, mandatory unblinking body cam policies with off-site backups, independent audits of impound practices, and transparent contract reviews for all vendors providing county services. They asked the court to require the department to enact stronger whistleblower protections to make it harder for internal actors to erase their own tracks. The courtroom drama that ensued was less cinematic than the impound lot, but no less satisfying. Experts validated the metadata on Alexis's phone extractions. Forensic accountants traced payments through layers of shell companies back to accounts associated with the contractor. Witnesses who had once kept quiet Civilians who recorded on their phones, the tow operator who had once been threatened, came forward and testified on the stand, under oath. One by one, the architecture of the conspiracy revealed itself, routine acts made structural through habit and reinforced by people who benefited from them. The defense attempted to paint the acts as isolated mistakes, operational errors in a busy department, but the documents told another story. Recurring patterns, similar deletions, coordinated messaging to the press. Where the defense tried to argue ambiguity, the federal and civil teams put collections of small facts side by side until the outline of intent became clear. Meanwhile, the most delicate part of the victory lay with the family. Sarah's reputation had been smeared as quickly as anyone's could be in the local feeds. A smear that had once tried to depict her as interfering and overbearing now fell flat against the weight of official support. After a long, quiet day of hearings and depositions, she sat in the back seat of Harper's car and finally exhaled. Her hands, those hands that had laid out snack trays on school mornings and fielded angry emails from parents, were steady. "We did okay," she said, as if reciting a simple grocery list. "We did more than okay," Alexis replied. "We did what was needed." For a moment there was nothing more dramatic to say. They had not erased the fact of violence. Scars lingered and could not be wished away. But they had carved into the record something worse for those who had chosen to hide wrongdoing than the mild awkwardness of PR. They had produced enforceable evidence. After the indictments, the sheriff's office announced internal disciplinary actions and signaled an openness to reform. In the ensuing months, the county agreed to a federal consent decree requiring federal monitoring of body cam policies, chain of custody protocols for digital evidence, and a review of contracts for detention services. Northbridge Logistics faced civil suits and criminal exposure. Deputies implicated in the conspiracy were suspended, then indicted. Some pleaded guilty and agreed to testify. Others awaited their fates with the uneasy stoicism of those who once assumed immunity. Alexis did not relish the attention at the center of it all.
The trade-off had been force for protection, not vengeance. Under Harper's counsel and Cross's continued oversight, she agreed to give deposition testimony and to cooperate fully with grand juries. Her credibility, honed by decades of command and disciplined by the rigors of combat, became a weapon not for aggression but for truth. In a quieter turn, Alexis was offered, and she accepted, a role she had never imagined, an invitation to co-chair a federal task force on use of force policy in the region. It was an unpaid role, mostly advisory, but it mattered because it came with real influence over training, procurement, and oversight protocols. Her acceptance letter was less about personal glory and more about duty, to ensure the lessons from what had happened in that county would not simply be headlines, but changes with teeth. Community groups pushed for more than policy changes. They rallied for transparency, public audits of the sheriff's office, a civilian oversight board with subpoena power, and scholarships in Alexis' name for young people interested in public service. Her name, once a hashtag of outrage, became a banner for reform. But changes exacted their own price. The months after the indictments were noisy. Threats persisted in the background, some anonymous and trivial, others more concerning. Alexis took to sleeping in a bedroom away from the front of her mother's house for a while. She had security measures installed that she disliked but accepted. The intimacy of normal life, sitting at dawn with a cup of coffee while the county woke, was altered by the knowledge that the fight had made them visible. Sarah, however, surprised everyone, including Alexis. She did not seek limelight, but she found a kind of new strength in it. Schools invited her to speak on civics. Local coalitions asked her to lead meetings on victims' rights. When the DOJ formed the Oversight Commission, it was Sarah's voice from the community side that often bridged the gap between federal procedure and local lived experience. She mentored young women who'd been intimidated by the system, those who had been the targets of petty authority and still wondered if their complaints mattered. The town healed in fits. Some residents still defended the sheriff's office as if loyalty came before law. Others, newly emboldened, called for audits in public meetings where once they had bitten their tongues. A veterans group that had marched in solidarity with Alexis formed a legal aid fund to help others pursue civil suits against abusive policing. Reform had started to seed itself in the architecture of the county. The day in court when Judge Marshall dismissed the local charges against Alexis with prejudice, that is, permanently, felt like a small benediction. The federal cases continued. Justice in the long view is not instant, but to have the local stain removed felt like a clearing of air. Harper hugged her after the ruling, tight and wordless.
Sarah watched from the gallery, hand over mouth, her face wet not from tears of performance, but from the relief that comes of right nearly done. There was, inevitably, a reckoning within the sheriff's office. The sheriff himself, who had attempted to distance his leadership from the rogue acts, found his election threatened. A recall petition gained traction. The county's contract procedures were overhauled. An independent auditor was installed. For the men who had cooperated with the scheme, some were given plea deals in exchange for testimony. Others faced sentencing. Among the most interesting and perhaps least expected consequences was the way those who had tried to weaponize Sarah's ordinariness against Alexis were undone by it. The title that had been used to belittle, a school secretary, a small-town woman,
became a kind of civic armor. It forced a reconceptualization. Power does not always look like a title. Sometimes it looks like community trust and the right to be heard. When the county heard Sarah speak at hearings, clear-eyed, patient, and direct, people who had once mouthed off about the wards remembered that the woman they'd lashed into the narrative had been a person who'd spent decades quietly binding a community together. The moral contour of the narrative shifted. Months later, in a modest office space the county had agreed to make available for community events, Alexis stood at a table and watched a group of local leaders discuss a proposed civilian oversight charter. Sarah sat beside her, not at the center but clearly present, offering a kind hand when a trainee spoke and needed encouragement. Cameras were there to cover the meeting, not in the voyeuristic way they had been the night of the stop, but as a record of civic engagement. "You turned this into a tool," a local organizer told Alexis afterward. "You turned pain into policy." Alexis only smiled, a small tightening at the corner of her mouth. "I didn't do it alone," she said. "We made it a record." The final formal mark of the story came in a sealed agreement the county signed with the DOJ, a consent decree that required independent monitoring of the sheriff's office for a period long enough to ensure the cultural changes were not merely cosmetic. The county agreed to vendor transparency, mandatory external audits, and a public database where redacted incident reports would be available to citizens. There would be training updates, a whistleblower hotline monitored by a neutral third party, and a requirement that all body cams be tethered to an off-site server incapable of unilateral deletion by local IT. When the news of the consent decree dropped, panic among the remaining conspirators flared again, not because paper had changed hearts, but because paper now carried practical consequences. Assets were frozen, contracts revisited, and officials who had once thumbed their noses at oversight found themselves subpoenaed. The local power dynamics had shifted.
And in the small, quieter way that mattered most to Alexis, the mother-daughter relationship settled into a new rhythm. Where there had been fear and worry, there was now an intimacy of common cause. They ate dinners where conversations sometimes drifted into the mundane, a burnt pie, a broken fence, and sometimes into the weightier of policy and how to make sure the changes stuck. Sarah's laugh returned, slow but real, the small bell it had always been. One evening, as autumn pressed in and leaves made the porch steps crackle, Alexis stood with her mother on that same sagging porch, where months earlier a deputy had shoved a woman for asking a question. The stars were out, indifferent and distant. "You were terrified," Sarah said softly. "I was," Alexis admitted. "You kept going," Sarah said, not out of hatred, but out of a refusal to let them get away with it. Alexis looked out into the yard, where their neighbors' houses were lit one by one. "We showed them what happens when you try to privatize accountability. You can't scrub the record forever." Sarah touched her daughter's arm, "And if they forget, we'll be here to remind them." The work, both acknowledged and unfinished, moved on. New policies took time to stick. A few bad actors evaded full accountability. Some found slips through weak prosecutions. Others retired quietly and disappeared into private life. That was always the cold taste of institutional fights, imperfect wins that nevertheless mattered. When the federal task force convened months later, Alexis sat at the table with other experts and community representatives. She listened as reform proposals were debated and refined. The job did not erase what she had been through, but it gave that experience a purpose beyond personal vindication, to design systems that made evidence more durable, to strengthen oversight such that one county's pattern could not metastasize elsewhere. On the day the case closed, when plea agreements were finalized and sentences handed down, Harper, Sarah, and Alexis walked out of the courthouse. They did not celebrate with champagne or flares. They shook hands with weary satisfaction. There would be longer trials to come in other cases, other counties, other vendors. The struggle for accountability had not ended with their story. It had merely become louder, and that louder sound was what would stop the next thing from happening with such casual cruelty. As they exited, a local reporter asked Sarah how she felt about being thrust into the center of a federal case. Sarah considered for only a second. "I felt like someone had to stand up," she said simply. "Someone had to be the one to say it wasn't acceptable. I'm just glad other people decided to be brave too." The title of the headline that later ran in the state paper was blunt and precise. "Cops brutally attack the albino girl at a stop, then panic when they learn who her mother is now." It was meant to rouse and to sell.
In the context of the months that followed, it functioned less as a provocation and more as a signpost. People who had been overlooked were now forces to be accounted for. The panic, when it came, was not melodrama, but consequence. In the years that followed, Alexis kept a small ritual. On the anniversary of the stop, she would drive out to the impound lot, park where she had once watched shadows, and play back a clip of the morning federal vehicles arrived. She did it not for vengeance, but as an archival act, proof that the truth had been available if only someone had the courage and resources to chase it down. She would sit for a few minutes, hands folded, then drive home to her mother's house, where the kettle was usually on and the porch light always left for company. People ask me if justice felt like revenge, she told a panel once, years later. It didn't. It felt like the world recognizing what had already happened. That's different. It doesn't undo the harm. It makes certain the harm becomes part of history, not an ongoing program. The county changed in increments. Policies were rewritten. The vendors changed their accounting systems. The small town learned to ask harder questions at board meetings. A new rule required body cam footage to be uploaded to a cloud server within 12 hours, accessible to an independent auditor. Contracts with private detention facilities required public disclosure. Whistleblower protections became a line item in the county budget. And in the end, the thing that mattered most to Alexis was not the indictments, nor the consent decree, but a quieter measure. A child at a town hall event years later, who looked at her with a mix of curiosity and reverence, said, "I want to be like you when I grow up." That was the bridge from personal survival to communal reform, a handing onward that felt like purpose. The story of the stop had begun with a night of fear and force. It ended with the slow, stubborn accretion of accountability. The men who had thought themselves untouchable had panicked when they learned who Sarah Ward was now, not because she had a flashy title that had always belonged to a different world, but because she had become, by circumstance and courage, a claimant to the public record. That claim made power tremble. If you want to see more cases where ordinary people forced institutions to answer, subscribe and watch these two hand-picked stories next: how Evans changed the outcome in a police misconduct case in another county, and the investigation that exposed a pay-to-play contract scheme at a correctional vendor. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to know what accountability looks like.